They ended up reconfiguring the domain name for a 50-person organization without the organization's support, which meant that the organization lost access to all email and all of their accounts for a weekend.
That's Noah Landow. He runs Backtest, a New York tech consulting firm, for almost 30 years. Stay with this one. By the end, you know exactly why the convenient tech choice always seems fine right up until it isn't, and a simple habit that protects you from losing access to your own domain. Noah, you've spent nearly 3 decades helping startups and nonprofits make technology decisions, and you've seen how these decisions age. When founders tell you, we wish we had heard this conversation a year ago, what are they usually realizing too late?
It varies depending on what kind of organization they are, what their role is, and where they are in their business evolution and growth. One example was a cosmetics company that had been extremely successful and was crossing the 500-person headcount internationally. And they had built some technology for managing identity and security when they were in the 30, 40, 50-person range, and then not looked at it again until suddenly they were hundreds and hundreds of people in 7 or 8 different countries. And the process to fix some of the choices they had made, which were reasonable choices at the 30, 40-person scale, the complexity and disruption necessary in order to affect those changes now was daunting. We did help them through it, but an order of magnitude more expensive and more complicated, and took an enormously larger amount of coordination with much, much larger number of people. Obviously, you're larger, that's part of it, but certainly some of those are things that are much easier to build properly at a smaller scale and then just scale up. There's also areas where they were not able during that entire 3 or 4 year period to take advantage of some of these tools that would have meant, instead of having 300 people show up and get really frustrated that their computer was set up wrong and they didn't have a user account and they couldn't do this and this thing wasn't there and why am I going off to the store to do this? Those are all things that if the process was properly conceived of earlier, those automations would already be in place and would already be something that they would get the advantage of, as opposed to essentially having to do manually.
So you're a fan of solidifying the process early as possible.
It's a good statement that would be hard pressed to argue with, but the process does change. For example, if they were to keep scaling and to hit 1,000 systems, that makes sense at a couple of hundred would probably again be appropriate to revise. So it's not a crystal ball able to see the future and be like, do it right the first time. It's tempting, I think, particularly for startups to be like, there's a right way and a wrong way. But I think it's more that there are an evolving set of considerations. The most useful mindset, I think, in that space is to think that, particularly as a founder, as a CEO, as a CTO that's product focused, you want to make sure somebody is paying attention to that, and it probably shouldn't be you. So our approach is typically to find partners who you can say, your job is to make sure that the stuff we're doing continues to make sense. And I'm going to be over here doing this growth stuff. That's my job. But you should come back to me in 6 months and be like, hold on a second, this thing we're doing doesn't make sense anymore. And that's an area in which hopefully you're focused on delivering the benefit of the organization you're building. Something I think about. There's parts of my business that I don't focus on a day-to-day basis, but it's my job to make sure that I've found somebody and given them responsibility, the tools, so that they can pay attention to that. And then tell me when it's like, hey, here's a time that we should talk about this change or this thing. We're coming up on a point where this renewal is something that we should be re-examining.
Definitely. So the process evolves, and we should always have someone else help us look at that.
I would encourage that as a starting condition. I think one of the things that's super interesting for us is that we often end up interacting with technically competent business leaders and owners. It's not usual for us to find somebody who could probably do this themselves, but in the same way as I probably shouldn't be running the kind of device deployment platform within my own company. I have a director of technology services and a technology services team. There are other people that are better equipped to handle that, but that doesn't mean I can't do it. And similarly, a lot of our clients, particularly in the startup space, are like, you could do it, but you shouldn't do it. And being smart about where you put your energy, I think, is there's a larger lesson there, but technology is one of the areas where that lesson, I think, is most acutely felt.
Definitely. So when founders think they're choosing convenient tech, what does that usually mean in practice?
Convenient tech is an interesting sort of turn of phrase. Obviously, technology, as you mentioned in the intro, I've been doing this for 30 years, and the world of technology has changed quite a bit over those 30 years. And what we expect from our technologies now is quite different from what we expected a decade ago or 2 decades or even more. I like to talk a little bit about this consumerification of IT, and the reason I like to think about it that way and talk about it particularly with high growth organizations is that many organizations there's a fork in the road. Many organizations are either coming at things from this startup space where they want to have a broad amount of access. People are empowered to make choices. They want to move quickly. They're prepared to make mistakes, and that's okay. And then the other is the sort of more traditional corporate enterprise mindset where it's like, hold on, everything has to be triple checked. You need an entire committee to decide, implement that thing until all of the kind of change management has been figured out. So those are obviously two different perspectives. The former is more appropriate for most smaller organizations and most startups, but there does come a point in an organization's life where at least some aspects of the second are important and valuable. And one of the things I think we've found super interesting over the last decade is this transition where many things that used to take a whole corporate process, you go to a vendor and you get a quote, and then you meet with a pre-sales engineer and they build a proof of concept, and then you do all these sort of like implementation process for months. Many of those systems now, an individual can just go to a website, type in a credit card and go. And that idea that it's like signing up for Netflix, but you're also signing up for your timesheet system or your HR platform, your HRIS. And I think that contrast, that consumerification, it's closely tied with a term that's used a great deal in the information security side called shadow IT. And shadow IT is just this idea that essentially in these larger corporate organizations, you typically want the tools that are implemented to be chosen carefully and thoughtfully and according to a set of kind of defined criteria. It's very easy to have systems in place where nothing prevents individuals from just going to Dropbox and creating a Dropbox account and dropping super critical confidential data into a Dropbox account that is not part of your system, or a Google Doc that's shared with their personal Gmail as opposed to a Google Workspace account that's owned by the organization. That kind of awareness or that kind of process, I think, it increases the convenience for moving quickly and solving problems, which is very exciting. But it's also quite easy to find yourself like popping your head above the hedge every once in a while and being like, how did we get here? We have so many systems and they don't work together. And like, how did we end up with this thing and this thing, which seem to be pointing in opposite directions? And so again, that's another area where we end up coming in and saying, okay, so your organization needs Google Cloud identity. You are being shared Google documents, but you also are primarily in Office 365. So your Microsoft is your primary kind of work group tool, but how do these two connect? Does everyone have a separate email? How do they not lose track of what their password is? What's the system that connects those? Are they federated? And that whole process of thinking about the balance between the convenience and security and ease of access and speed of change is, I think, it's not like there's a simple one-line answer that's the right way. Having tools and a perspective in place to keep an eye on that is important. I'm a believer in equipping the people who are doing the work with the tools to do their works. It's tempting in the IT landscape to solve that problem by locking everything down. And our perspective for many years has been to be careful not to do that, of a knee-jerk security reaction, which says, no, you can't do it. That's not a constructive way to help people get their job done. That locks them.
So you need a balance between centralized tools, making sure everything is in the right place, and employees to innovate and test out new tools because so many are coming out these days.
The tools is an excellent area of focus, but we often think about it the other way, which is that people best equipped to understand how the problem is optimally solved are those individuals, not the IT department, making sure that the choices can be driven by the individuals who are trying to solve the problem. The person who sits there and is like, I need to create this event management something in order to solve this problem. That's the person who actually knows what the criteria are to succeed, not the person 3 layers away in an IT department who's like, which of these products should I choose? So we want to make sure, whenever possible, that the people who are doing the work are also helping to drive the decision, that the invested stakeholders in the systems that are chosen. And in many cases, that means by equipping them within reasonable sanity with the means to do some of their selection and verification on their own.
Definitely. So why does convenience so often turn into a long-term cost, even when the decision felt reasonable at the time?
I think some of it's scale. Some of it is a different process to maintain a technology system than it is to implement it. Dropbox being, I think, a light, silly example. You can sign up with Dropbox and you have a folder. But then over time, people start sticking other things in there. And then at some point, you're like, which of these are shared Dropbox folders and which of these are individual Dropbox folders? And does anyone know which of these is the right version? Is this the final one or is it the one that's labeled final? I think that lends itself to a tendency to focus not on the organizational systems themselves. In the graphic design visual world, it's often called production. Production is the person who makes sure all the pages are square and all the text is in the right place. Design is doing all these beautiful things. Those both serve purposes and those both overlap in a technology-centric space. Those are quite connected, front end, back end, all that kind of elements. But I do think it's particularly valuable and important to recognize that even a decision that was great at this point in time might be less great as the landscape you're operating within changes. It's also quite easy for apparently unrelated factors to influence sort of the appropriateness of individual tools. And examples of that are, we have an example in a book called Tame the Tech Beast. One of our examples, one of our stories is a web developer and a company who are implementing a new website design, and somebody in the project and product management side gives the domain management credentials, registration credentials to the web developer, and they make a series of changes that they expect to affect the website, but they don't realize they also affect email delivery. This is an organization that does mass email marketing. And of course, those things start bouncing and creating a terrible cascade. And those kind of unintended, unexpected results happen when organizations grow. The person in charge of launching the new website may have little to no awareness of the other things that are happening, of how many different services SendGrid. Those just might not be names that they're familiar with. And so they don't understand the ramifications of some of these decisions.
Definitely. So always make sure that you know how different systems are interacting, and the right people, they know what to do in case there's an issue that comes up.
I think you hinted at the idea of balance a few minutes ago. And I think that balance is critical. Both extremes are not fun. You don't want everything chaotically thrown at the wall and who knows what happens. But you also don't want everything so tightly controlled that nobody feels like they can actually do anything. Figuring out who the stakeholders are and ensuring that the individuals who are responsible for succeeding at doing the thing you want to do, just making sure that they're in the room when you're evaluating options is one of our little rules of thumb. Okay, who else is affected by this choice? We get a 15-minute meeting with these 3 or 4 people and explain what we intend to do before we do it, and make sure that we're not misunderstanding the ramifications of this.
Definitely. Quick pause. If this kind of conversation is useful for you, hitting subscribe means you catch the next one. That's it. Back to it. So you write a lot about ownership, devices, accounts, subscriptions. Where do founders most often give up ownership without realizing it?
So founders are often focused on business, corporate stuff ownership, areas that are easily missed, particularly by somebody who's moving relatively quickly. I say the area we get most nervous about when we engage with a fast-moving startup is the question of what accounts and registrations are accounted for in your record keeping. Keeping track of which computer you own and which phones and devices you own, conceptually obvious to most people. It's like a physical object. You're like, oh, we bought 6 laptops. Here's the serial numbers. Not all organizations do a great job at keeping track of that, but at least the idea that you ought to get track of that is relatively simple to understand. But what organizations sometimes lose track of surprisingly early, meaning when they're relatively small, is things like how many different domain registrations the organization has, and are all of their domains registered under 1 or 2 accounts? Who has access to those credentials? How are those credentials shared, if at all? A common way to solve that for organizations that are a little bit larger is to create some sort of password management work group tool. 1Password is our preferred, but there are many. So 1Password, for example, would allow you to create a super VIP, extra important, scary, powerful credentials vault, which is just a place to put a bunch of passwords. And you could say, hey, my hover.com domain registration is here. What often happens is organizations start off thinking, I've got company.ai, that's my name. And then they add another thing because they're like, oh, I want something that's a little shorter, or we're doing this spin-off project, or we want to do this marketing thing where we have 5 other domains. And maybe some of those can't be registered at the registrar that the first one is at. So they end up with another registrar in Singapore or Iceland or something. And so you end up with these different domain registrations at different companies, which often have different security requirements. Some of them might have multi-factor, and like, how does that multi-factor get stored so that you don't get locked out your cell phone, or is it to somebody else's cell phone? Is it to your intern's cell phone? So that awareness of maintaining a thoughtful record of the ephemeral assets of the account credentials, particularly for very small organizations. So there's a couple of rules of thumb. Maybe this is helpful for listeners. A couple of rules of thumb that if you're 3 or 4 people, that you can do with minimal cost impact that will be very valuable in the future. And one of the small areas that is a great piece of advice is to think about access to really important credentials, not as an individual personal process, but as a role-based process. So that would mean, for example, saying, hey, we're setting up these super admin accounts for Microsoft or Google or a domain registrar or Squarespace or Lovable or whatever my tool set is. And instead of thinking of, I'm John Smith and I'm going to set up this, or I'm Jane Doe and I'm going to set up this account, to think of those instead as an administrative role, not but a separate one. So it might be like IT admin or IT at the domain registration that you're using as your primary.
Yeah.
And so that's an area of saying, hey, thinking about this is like the master owner of this stuff should be protected and controlled, and multi-factor should be turned on, and you should have backup code, standard security practices, but separating out these administrative functions from your day-to-day. That helps ensure in a security space that if you accidentally get phished or you type your credentials in to something that you shouldn't, it may be sort of super admin credentials for your company are separate from your individual account credentials. So that's practical advice, is to take a moment, add 1 or 2 more accounts for these administrative IT accounts early in the process. Don't wait until you're much larger and you realize that you've lost track of who counts. And that way you can say that account becomes the owner of the domain registration or Apple Maps site address or all those kind of things.
So separation from role-based to individual-based, like those emails, like sales at a website.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are often done in 2 different ways. Sales at, for example, is off like maybe a ticketing system or some sort of group mailbox. And you can do that. The conceptual distinction that's important is to think of it as I, Noah, am not going to log in as IT admin in order to make this critical DNS change on a regular ongoing basis. I'm only going to do that when I know that there's something critical and important I'm going to do. So I'll pause for a second, maybe open up a new private browser window, type in those credentials, and I'll be very intentional about the fact that I'm now holding this very powerful key. And then during my everyday to day, when I'm just sending emails and sitting on my phone and typing and clicking links, I'm not logged into that account. So I'm maintaining a separation from that.
Definitely. So what's the moment when founders usually realize, oh, this is going to be painful to undo?
I think it varies a little bit on the level of expertise. And in my experience, most founders who are successfully growing don't worry too much about that. I think it's maybe a personality trait that goes along with the desire to grow, is like, we'll figure it out. So the things that we are concerned about are more the things that people experience or HR gets concerned about, less that the founder themselves do. Obviously, there's some technical components. I think HR and insurance and some of the business practice pieces do come up, but those are typically areas that somebody else goes back to the founder and is like, so here's a choice we made that we maybe need to deal with now. And the founder is often, okay, well, go deal with it. That's your job. So that I think can be healthy. I know as a person who is both CEO and founder for my own organization, there are times where I recognize that something needs to be done differently. And it is helpful to say, I'm not going to be the one who implements this. This person is the person who's going to implement it. So I want to go to them and say, which of these things are you concerned about? And which of these do you think we should change now? And which of these things do you think we could hold off for a little while? Part of that, I think, is finding a balance, but being thoughtful about where you are in your projections and your growth. If you think you're going to double in the next 2 months, then your anticipated and allowed for pain points will be very different if you're expecting to grow slowly over the next 6 months.
So can you walk through a real example without naming names where a small decision created a big cleanup later?
Where the domain registration one I mentioned before is a great example. We did have a scenario where we had an organization which had multiple investors and partners and had a very dynamic, very driven founder, very personality driven in their leadership style. They had a disagreement with the board and with their executive team and ended up leaving. It was a contentious departure. And after they departed, there was a disagreement about who owned the domain name. So they ended up reconfiguring the domain name for a 50-person organization without the organization's support, which meant that the organization lost access to all email and all of their accounts for a weekend. So it was quite a dramatic moment. Litigation and a bunch of legal stuff was involved. But I think that was a great example of recognizing that who owns the domain name is easy to overlook. It's remarkable how often that is something that organizations don't think to go back and check a few years in.
So making sure that multiple people in the organization owns the domain name in case something like this happens.
Many domain name registrars, which is the company that is responsible, many of them don't really allow multiple people to own the domain name in the way that you would think. Then there's a single owner or registrant. And often that owner or registrant is hidden from public view for privacy reasons. The people who own the domain don't want to get a bunch of junk solicitations. So their name is filtered by the domain registrar. So it can often be, if you are yourself not the person that has the passwords, it can be unclear how you determine who the owner is. That's happened a couple of times recently, even on an organization that I've been involved with for 10 years. We were like, we have these 2 domain names are part of our group, but this one is not. What's that? And then it actually took a couple of months of inquiry and sending messages and eventually finding the person who did actually own that. That's an example of one where the answer isn't necessarily that multiple people should have access, although that would be a reasonable way to solve the problem. It's often more just making sure you're clear. It's like, where are our articles of incorporation and who has a copy of the bylaws? And like we actually have a folder somewhere where we've put that. And can I put my hands on that at a moment's notice? I encourage people to think about some of these things the same way that they would think about critical business records. Somebody of executive level should have a pretty good idea where those things are at all times. Of course, there's a relatively long list of potential things, but domain registers are the easiest, most obvious one to talk about in this context. Almost every organization has that as a dependency at this day and age.
So how should founders think about trust when they outsource tech, especially early on?
Trust is absolutely integral to everything an IT or technology company is doing for another organization. It's something we talk about all the time. Trust is the kind of thing that you earn by not making mistakes and being reliable and being responsive and listening, but it's also something that you have to cultivate and grow over time. Ultimately, the two most important components of choosing your trusted vendors are: one, what is your criteria that you're using to judge this? Are they a referral from someone you know? Are they somebody that peers use? Are they somebody that you've used before? Like, what's the basis of the relationship to this person or this organization? What's the nature of the expectation and commitment? How clear and effective is the communication? You may have an organization that is amazing at doing this one thing, and you don't really know the difference between DevOps and device administration. And you're like, should I trust you with that too? Our ultimate take on that is that you want to identify, particularly as a founder, organizations that are the right scale so that you can feel like you have a clear and effective communication with the people you're working with. For example, if you're a founder with half a dozen people on your team, one of the giant consulting firms like Accenture or IBM is probably not going to be instructive because there's just too many people in the room. It's too complicated. But a single person on their own, maybe if you know them well and you have a strong rapport, might be constructive, but many organizations would do better with a slightly larger, maybe a few people, maybe a partner or two. So finding the balance of how much of a range of competency, how much of a depth of expertise. We think about that a great deal in terms of, we've obviously been around for a long time. So for many of our clients, we have worked with somebody there before. That's referral based. That's not true with all. We do get people who just find us on ChatGPT and are just looking for solutions. That's valid. I think there are times nowadays where searching and saying, hey, I want to redo my identity management platform for my 50-person company, and I'm currently using this Microsoft Azure thing, and I want to move to something more modern, and I want to be cross-platform, and I don't want it to be too complicated. Maybe your searching comes up with a name like JumpCloud, and you're like, okay, I want to find a great JumpCloud company who I can talk to about this, who has done this kind of thing before. So there is a component of doing a little bit of work to learn and vet and get a sense. And like any other hiring or vendor or relationship selection, there's a component to trusting your gut and doing a little bit of the work to talk to the organizations that are connected to these service providers.
So for non-technical founders, which tech decisions are worth pausing on and which ones don't matter as much?
I would say that it is surprisingly impactful whether your organization is using Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. That is the kind of thing that often just happens for organizations. Typically, it's usually whichever the founder is used to, but that's an area where I would encourage organizations and founders to pause for a second and think that through. It's not impossible to change. It is possible to use both constructively at the very small scale. Managing the two of them connecting correctly to each other is an easy mistake often made. The central idea of having a software tool that is the main source of truth for what equipment you own and who should have access to critical resources in the technology landscape that's often called an identity and workstation management system. The tool that we typically use is called JumpCloud. JumpCloud is an IDP or identity provider. And JumpCloud combines the benefits of many other different systems into an identity. It says, I'm Noah, and this is my username and my password. But it also allows me to connect to other services. It can be federated with and connect to Google, connect to Microsoft, connect to Harvest, connect to Xero. The idea that you're using these tools to build an authoritative record of who in your organization should have access to which systems. And as one of its side effects, if you set it up in a typical way, it ensures that you have a good record of what equipment you own and what AI tools your organization is using. And allows you to track passwords, and there's a number of other things that these kind of systems permit. Cloud isn't the right solution for every organization, but I would say if an organization doesn't have any idea where to start, I think it's a great place to start. The barrier to entry is very low. A non-technical person can set it up, although it's fairly common for a non-technical person to set it up and not take full advantage. So it's probably worth relatively early engaging somebody like us to help figure out which of the features are worth implementing and why and when.
Definitely. So get started early on access management and get help.
Think that through. Exactly. Take a moment and have a brief conversation. It's better to have that conversation a year ahead of time and have a one-pager in your back pocket that you can pull out when you're ready than to wait until you suddenly need to make a decision and then you need to figure out who to talk to and how to ask the right questions.
So if a founder could only have one tech conversation earlier than they usually do, what should it be about?
I think it would probably be about security, specifically for most organizations in this day and age, particularly if they're remote and if they're focused on multiple tools. The single most important thing I would say is this idea of identity, making sure that you have individuals who have an awareness of how the sort of access to systems works, and that you have done best in breed kind of configuration to lock and control access to those accounts. We've actually reached a point in the last few years where many insurance providers, particularly for cybersecurity policies, are now requiring some of these policies and some of these configurations to be in place and operational before they'll offer coverage. That was not true a decade ago. So that's an area where even at the very small scale, understanding what are the ramifications of not making these changes is often some significant business risk. So I think identity is the area that we would say, if you're going to pick somewhere, that's the area that is most valuable. It's also the area that you can build relatively simple and then continue to add more on over time.
Definitely identity to get started. So if a founder listening feels like they may have already made some of these convenience-driven decisions, what's the first calm step they should take next?
I think if they're nervous, probably doing some fairly typical research, poking around a little bit to be like, I made this decision. Does this seem right? Many founders I speak to now, particularly in the technology adjacent world, are using an AI tool to serve as a second voice in their head. I think there's some benefit to some risk. Early on, I would encourage founders to reach out to an organization. And MSP is one of the terms for the kind of work we do, or a technology consultancy. We're unusual in that we do both, but to reach out to an organization like us or a trusted friend. It's completely reasonable to talk to the IT guy or the tech guy of this particular friend of yours. It's valuable, just like talking to an AI tool, not to take what you hear back as the answer, but as something that helps inform your understanding of how you evaluate and make choices. Similarly, you might end up asking for advice or introductions to more than one person or an organization and say, hey, I'm going to talk to this bigger corporate group and maybe this sort of friend of a friend as well. Running through some of the choices you're thinking about early on and getting feedback. You'll get different answers from different people. And I think that's healthy and constructive to figure out how to navigate those variants.
So get feedback from your technical friends.
Yeah, get someone a cup of coffee and run some ideas by them or ask for a referral. The more complicated the technology questions you're asking, the more access you'll have to grant to get meaningful answers. But in most cases, a lot of what we're talking about at this scale, you can explain in the abstract. Again, assuming you have a basic understanding of what you're doing, you can explain what you think you're doing and say, does that seem reasonable? And if the person looks panicked and horrified, then maybe you can go into a little more detail. But if the thing you've done is very reasonable, most people with a background will be able to say, oh yeah, that's a normal thing to do. That doesn't seem strange. Why are you concerned about that? And I think that's a healthy process for a founder to understand.
Thank you so much, Noah, for coming on the podcast and for sharing all of your insights.
My pleasure. It's been great to be here and excited to share some of these outside of the context of the book.
You can read more founder stories like this at techforfounder.com.